STAAR PowerPoint Part 4. We're going to take up where we left off from yesterday's. We ended Part 3, and we'll continue with the speculation boom. So let's go ahead and get started with it. The speculation boom, as you can see here, definition of speculation, the purchase of an item not for personal use, but in the hope of selling it later. And this is really kind of the important part, not for personal use, in the hope of selling it later at a higher profit, a higher price way to make a profit. And so this is associated in the 1920s with the stock market. Got a little bit of a political cartoon down here. Stock market on the ride, and you have a roller coaster going up and down and up and down. That's kind of what happened in the stock market. Generally speaking, really like here, going up, and then of course it gets to this point, and boom, there is a huge drop right there. Anyway, but speculation is really more thought about in today's world with real estate, buying a property, and here we have an ad of that time, 10 acres for $150, which is today's prices, even in a place like the Valley, which doesn't really have a lot of high market value property. You couldn't buy 10 acres for $150. You couldn't buy 10 feet worth of property today for $150. So again, prices have risen quite a bit, inflation, and a number of other reasons. But anyway, getting back to speculation boom, people were buying stocks, buying property, hoping to flip it over, turn it around, and sell it in a relatively short period of time and make a good profit. Again, nothing really wrong with that. People have been doing that for a long time. The problem was a lot of them were borrowing money in order to do so. And the more that they borrowed, the more they could buy, the more profit they could make when they sold it. The problem is, as we see right here, and let me clear this up a little bit right there. Okay, as we see with this roller coaster, and as long as prices are rising, we're doing well. But occasionally they will plateau. They will plateau, and then they fall. And that's what happened with the stock market. So if you borrow $10,000 to buy stock, and the stock goes up in value, you sell it, and you make a nice little profit. If you borrow $10,000 and the price stagnates or the price falls, as we see right here, price falling, prices going down and down, then you can't pay off your loan, and then the banks foreclose and take your house, your car, your wife's jewelry, clothing, whatever the case may be. Okay, let's get it back to this last bullet. The price of a share of a corporation stock would skyrocket as more and more people began to invest to buy stocks in the stock market. Concept of supply and demand. As demand goes up, so do prices. And it doesn't really matter what we're talking about. Stocks, donuts, Ferraris, it's the same thing. All right, let's go to our next slide, uneven prosperity. The concept of uneven prosperity, and we have a couple illustrations here. We're not going to look at them in great depth. The pyramid of wealth in the bottom, the top 1%, $50,000 or more, the top 2.9%, $10,000 or more, 71%, again, $2,500 or less. Okay. Not everyone shared in the prosperity of the 1920s. Not everyone shared in that. We've already talked about this a little bit. Farmers in particular, which we'll take a look at in the third bullet, they had a rough time in the 20s. Let's go to our second bullet. A small percentage of Americans had the largest percent of the wealth. Now, I don't know if this is just a natural order of things, or if this is due to the economic system we have in America, but again, that's still somewhat to the case today. I do think that wealth is a little bit more widespread today than it was in the 1920s. There are far more opportunities for people, far more educational opportunities and job opportunities in the 21st century than there were in the 20th century. But again, there is still your very, very super rich, your billionaires, Bill Gates, and those individuals, and then we have people who are barely getting by. Now, again, is Bill Gates just lucky or smarter than everybody else? Well, yeah, I mean, he's probably smarter than most people, and he's probably a little bit more lucky than many. But our system allows people to rise above their birth. Bill Gates was not born rich. He was able to work his way up, as has many others. Okay, let's move on. Our third bullet, with new farm equipment, electricity, and fertilizer costs all rising, of course. Farmers face lower incomes due to overproduction, overproducing crops. So what we have is we have electricity, we have fertilizer costs, we have everything associated with farming is going up in cost. But farmers are making less money. Why are they making less money? Why are they incomes lower? They've overproduced, and so there is a larger supply than necessary. There's a larger supply than demand requires, and so prices fall. If the supply of something goes up again, it doesn't matter what it is. If the supply increases dramatically, then prices fall. That's just supply and demand. That's just basic economics. Textile workers, people working in textile factories, face competition for jobs with immigrants. And we've talked about this previously in other chapters, from 1870 to about 1900 or so. About 30 million immigrants came to America. Many of them would work in the factories doing some of the extremely boring, dangerous, disgusting labor that Americans didn't want to do, or wanted to do, but the immigrants would do it for less money. And so we still have that problem today. There is quite a bit of competition for jobs, and the competition Americans have would be with immigrants coming to this country. Minority groups still face discrimination. Women, blacks, to a smaller extent Hispanics, but women and blacks. And of course you could look at some of the recent immigrants as being minority groups as well. So they face discrimination in the workplace, and therefore they had problems. So uneven prosperity, we have a number of groups that are not doing well. Minority groups, workers who are facing competition from immigrants, and then of course we have farmers, okay, because of the cost of farm equipment, because the cost of electricity and fertilizer is going up, and because they are overproducing, farmers were suffering economically. All right, let's move forward. Go into another little short section here, our learning objective. How did cultural values change in this period of time? So in the next 7-8 slides or so, we're going to look at how did the cultural values of America change, and we're going to look at a couple things. The first one would be prohibition, which is what we call essentially the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment called for an end of the manufacturing, sale, and consumption of alcohol. We refer to that as prohibition. And then we had religion versus science, and of course, first thing that should come to your mind is the Scopes monkey trial. All right, let's move forward. The temperance movement and prohibition. We have a couple of images here on the right. At the bottom of the page, we have Francis Willard, who was the president of the WCTU, and this was a temperance movement of the period of time. She was president there. You can see the years when she was president. And at the top of the page, right up in here, we see several ladies holding up a sign: "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." Okay, so we are looking at a dedicated movement to end alcohol here in America. This is nothing new. We've talked about this previously. This goes back for decades. During the Progressive Era, period of time from roughly 1865 to about 1900, scratch all that, and scratch all that. That was the Gilded Age. I'm sorry. The Progressive Era starts when the Gilded Age ended in about 1900 or so, and the Progressive Era goes from about 1900 to about 1920, give or take. You could argue we still have a little bit of progressivism going on today. We'll talk about that as we get to it down the road. So the Gilded Age from about 1865 to about 1900, Progressive Era from about 1900 to about 1920. Sorry about that original mistake. The Progressive Era, during that we saw the growth of the temperance movement. Okay, and of course temperance is basically those who are against the drinking of alcohol. Those individuals, and here is a chunk of them, people like there and here, were instrumental in the passage of the 18th Amendment, which, as I said earlier, banned the manufacturing, the consumption, the sale and consumption of alcohol. The temperance movement thought that drinking alcohol was sinful, led to crime, and domestic violence. Now, the sin part we're not really going to worry about, okay? Whether drinking alcohol is a sin is a highly debatable topic. You should, if you really want to go into it, talk to your minister, your priest. Those who like to drink will argue, well, Jesus drank wine. One of his first miracles was to convert water to wine. And then those who are opposed to, well, that's all they had. The water, there was no purification at the time. You drank the water, you got sick. There's no Coca-Cola, no tea, whatever, okay? And we're not going to get into that. Again, if you're interested, talk to a man or woman of the clergy, okay? Yeah. But let's go to the next 2 points. Did drinking lead to crime? You could argue yes, and you could probably back it up with some fair and middling statistics that would support that thought. Did it lead to domestic violence? Well, yeah, it probably did. And so women were complaining that their husbands were coming home drunk. And let's overlook for the moment the amount of money being spent at the local bar. They would come home and become abusive toward themselves. The men would be abusive toward their wives or toward their children. That's domestic violence. And again, we're not really going to look at how much money was spent at the bars, local saloons, and all the things that could happen there. Usually there was gambling and women and all kinds of evil things, whichever your point of view is, happening there. But again, we're looking at, from the temperance movement's point of view, those things. That's why they wanted to end it. Frances Willard, and again, we have a picture of Frances over here, an outspoken leader of the temperance movement, a leader of women's rights, women's suffrage, and better working conditions for labor. Now, for this last one, for labor, that's really for both genders. But her work on temperance, of course, women's rights and women's suffrage, well, that was generally aimed at women in the country, benefiting them. And eventually, of course, women did gain universal suffrage with the 19th Amendment. Women's rights pretty much has been addressed through the decades. And, of course, the temperance movement, we tried. It failed miserably, and we did away with it. Move on to our next slide, prohibition. And here we have, in the upper right-hand corner, the U.S. is voted dry. The 36th state, right here, okay, the 36th state ratified the 18th Amendment, which means that it passes, it becomes the law of the land. What you have down here in this picture is a young man going to a speakeasy, and here is speakeasy, which was a place that you could find liquor. It was a underground bar. Okay. Anyway, let's get back to bullet number 1. In 1919, U.S. Congress passed the 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture, sale, distribution, consumption of alcohol. So in 1919, 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and distribution, consumption of alcohol. However, instead of people obeying the law, there was a growing disrespect for the law. And instead of people saying, you know what, it's the law, I'm never going to drink again, they started to drink. Speakeasies. And bootlegging is the illegal transportation of liquor. Okay. Speakeasies were a place where you could go get a drink, and again, we have an image of that right here. A guy knock on the door, and then, there's a password. Al sent me, or the chair's up against the wall, or it doesn't really matter. Okay, they could vary, and I think we saw an example of this in the video I showed you a couple of days ago of speakeasies and how easy they were to be set up. Anyway, so speakeasies and bootlegging alcohol allow the average consumer to obtain liquor really without any problems. So the 18th Amendment, prohibition, and here's a cute little picture, gangster with a Tommy gun, machine gun, which, of course, is one of the growths from prohibition. We'll talk about that. Anyway, prohibition, 1919, 18th Amendment, banned the manufacture, sale, distribution, and consumption of alcohol. Let's move forward. And we continue with prohibition, the 18th Amendment. Here we have, at the bottom of the page, Al Capone. Al Capone is the most notorious gangster of all time. Nicknamed Scarface. There's a scar on his cheek. You can't really see it from this photo. The most wanted, the most vicious, the most well-known gangster of the 20s. He owned Chicago. He literally ran the city of Chicago, even from jail. He ran his organization. Picture up here. Prohibition takes effect July 1st. Buy now and save money. And so they were selling liquor, sort of store it up. Okay, let's move forward. Many Americans believe that prohibition tried to force one group's morals on other groups. Again, when you think about it, that's kind of what laws are in many cases. There are many laws that are essentially moral determinations. We believe that murder is wrong. I mean, whether this be religious or not, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill. Actually, I think the original version is, or the original text is, thou shalt not murder. But okay, it's against our religious moral beliefs to commit murder, so therefore we made a law against it. Again, I think most people tend to accept that, but drinking, in which of course prohibition did away with, is a particular moral that not everybody shares. Pretty much everybody, a good chunk of the country, 90+% of the country, I would imagine, have a view that murder is wrong. So therefore, there are laws against it. However, the percentage of people who were opposed to drinking of liquor was far less. I would probably say less than 50%, far less than 50% at the time. And they, however, were the most outspoken, and they had the best backing, and so therefore, they got what they wanted. Still, others opposed to prohibition because it closed breweries, bars, distilleries where thousands worked. It was more of a economic issue with some. Prohibition closed down these places, breweries, bars, distilleries, and how many people lost their jobs? Thousands. Many said, in the third bullet, prohibition led to an increase in organized crime. It did. The gangsters, there's Al right there, Al Capone, which willingly, for a price, supplied illegal booze to its consumers, to its customers. They became rich and famous. And I think this part right here is almost as important as this part. Al Capone was a celebrity. It was said that the mayor of Chicago had an autographed picture of Al Capone in his office. So these gangsters, people like Al Capone, became rich and famous because they were willing to break the law, supply liquor, whether it be in a speakeasy or out of a car. They were willing to supply this liquor which was, of course, is illegal thanks to Prohibition, for a price, and they became rich and famous. And, of course, there was a great deal of violence that was associated with it. We have kind of experienced this, though the Valley is not as bad as many places in the country, with the drug wars. There are all kinds of drug-related, gang-related shootings and violence in bigger cities because different gangs, whether it be groups like the Bloods or the Crips or biker gangs, are fighting over turf where they will then sell, or where they will sell their product, whether it be marijuana, cocaine. It doesn't really matter what it is. And so we sort of saw the same thing, but with alcohol in the 1920s, hence the rise of the gangster. Okay. By 1933, the American public saw that Prohibition was a failed experiment. In 1933, we are still in a recession, moving toward a depression. Herbert Hoover is out of office in 33, or at least by March or April 33, Franklin Roosevelt becomes president, when FDR becomes president. And it was determined that we need to do away with it because partially gangsters, and partially because of what was said in the previous slide, jobs. Breweries, distilleries, bars were not open, and those were legitimate jobs that could be making people money and then making the government money. Okay, let us continue with our second bullet. People have been unwilling to accept the law. President Warren G. Harding, president elected in 1920, served alcohol in the White House, even though it was against the law. So you have the president again. This is back in 1920, so you can well imagine how over the decade it got worse and worse. People didn't like the law, and so the 21st Amendment repealed or did away with Prohibition. Here's an example of some men who are picketing. We want beer. We want beer. Prohibition proved that unpopular laws are often unenforceable. More than unenforceable, sometimes the police are not willing to enforce it. And that causes much problems as anything else. And then over here, Prohibition ends at last. It was done away partially because it was failed. Okay, it was a failed experiment. It was done away with because of the growth of organized crime. It was done away with because people wanted to have a drink occasionally, because many people were. Even President Harding was serving alcohol in the White House. And it was not only difficult to enforce, it was often unenforced by those who were supposed to enforce it. So because of that, Prohibition ended. And let's just add one more thing here. Jobs. Okay, I don't know how easily that is seen. Jobs. We needed jobs in the 1930s. Those are the reasons why it was done away with. We got a couple more slides here in this little segment, and we'll move forward. The Scopes Monkey Trial. We have discussed this previously in the vocabulary terms and other places. Essentially what it evolves around is that John Scopes, when all this is mentioned down here, taught evolution to a biology class in Tennessee where it was against the law. He was arrested and tried, found guilty. He was ordered to pay a small fine, which he never did, and a year or so later the verdict was overturned. The Scopes Monkey Trial became the most sensational trial of the decade and probably the century. Now, the trial quickly devolved, if you pardon the pun, from Scopes being innocent or guilty to the Bible versus science. Darwin's theory of evolution, which of course was illegal to be taught in Tennessee, which is why Scopes got in trouble, because he taught that in his biology class in the state of Tennessee where it was illegal to do so. And Tennessee wasn't the only one many southern states have passed laws making it illegal to teach Darwin's theory. And it was the accepted theory of Genesis, creationism, that was the accepted theory. Not Scopes, not what Scopes taught, the theory of evolution from Darwin, that we, mankind, evolved from lower forms of life like the monkey. Okay, let's move forward. Here we have a little bit more information about the Scopes monkey trial. The top two, the picture in the top right, the two men. We have Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan is saying, men did not come from a monkey, and then Clarence Darrow is saying, you haven't seen my cousin. It's humor. Anyway, the middle picture we have a protest, the Anti-Evolution League. And then here at the bottom is science being taught in our schools. Okay. The Scopes monkey trial raises troubling questions. Is science being taught in our schools? Should children be exposed to facts? Okay. Again, by the way, we're still having this argument today. Do we teach evolution? Do we teach creationism? Do we teach a little bit of both? Do we not touch it? And on and on and on. And so these are issues that we still have to this day. So we got William Jennings Bryan, we got Clarence Darrow, and right over here. William Jennings Bryan, the pro-Bible, if you will, lawyer, prosecuted Scopes. Clarence Darrow, the pro-Darwin, if you will, lawyer, defended Scopes. The Scopes trial was the first to be broadcast over radio, and it pitted older religious beliefs against newer scientific theories. And I think the two key words here are theories, beliefs. It is difficult to prove much of what is said in the Bible. You have to take it on faith, hence the word belief. And a lot of the scientific stuff are just theories, have yet to be fully proven, like evolution. Clarence Darrow cross-examined Bryan, who was an expert on the Bible, about inconsistencies within the Bible, and made William Jennings Bryan look old school and out of touch with the modern world. Now again, there's nothing really wrong with being old school and out of touch with the modern world. But it happened in such a way that it discredited William Jennings Bryan's theories, his thoughts, his beliefs, and the thoughts and beliefs of the Christian fundamentalists, who essentially took every word from the Bible as to be the literal truth. The result of the trial, the Scopes was found guilty and fined $1. You know, I have seen the number $100. This has $1. It doesn't really matter what the amount is. He never paid it, and eventually, a year or so later, the verdict was overturned. Okay, we're going to stop it at this point and end our discussions, and we'll take up this in the next one. But this has been the STAAR PowerPoint, and this has been part 4. We're going to go ahead and end it at this time.